lists and maps and everything, and for this list we have to have, perform the streaming operations, because it provides you number of APIs which can be used for both configuration and also for the processing purposes. And why we moved to Java 1.8 and why we are using Java 1.8, the basic reason was that it helped us to write these functional codes. It reduced the boilerplate code and excess readability, and it reduced the complex structure. So it made coding much more simple, I can say.
So how will you make your, say for example, if you're writing a piece of code in your Java, so how will you make yourself flexible, like by doing a piece of code that this could be scalable or this could be performance best code? So how will you monitor that? So for example, you might have used a variable which is not used. You might have used loops which is never needed. So how will you monitor? How will you make sure your code is optimal? So what are all the steps you have taken, or what are the steps you would like to take to make sure the code is optimal?
Okay, so see,
you might have used different data structures, right? Like for example, you might have used array list. So in that case, you might need to go with hash map. So there are a couple of scenarios, right? So in that cases, like how will you identify to make sure that whatever the code you are writing is optimal or the performance best? Yeah.
Okay. So we have certain standards in our project. So if I start from the very basic, is that whenever we code, if we're using loops, we will not be doing 3 inner loops. The maximum will be 2, so that the coding remains simple. Now, if I come to the method structure, each of the method that we write in our project should not exceed 50 lines. So we are just increasing the modularity. And now if I come to the class structure should not exceed 350 lines. So this comes to the structural part. Now if I come to the functional part, so many of the times the most, even if we want to store some elements, say homogeneous elements, so what we use is list, but sometimes list is not is not optimized or not optimum, because you know that within list the main structure is arrays. So if I exclude or include something, so it will perform the positional changing for each and every object. So sometimes, most of the times what we do is that we replace list with linked lists, because we can use that linked list container structure for that, and it also is helpful for the iteration purposes. For one thing that we use list is that if we want to retrieve, for example, for most of the GET API that we write, we need to access the elements from certain positions, certain IDs. In that cases, we actually use array list because it helps our retrieval performance, because in array list you can retrieve the elements with the index. Now, when it comes to maps and hash maps, so sometimes it depends on what we need. We need a synchronized one or a non-synchronized one. So sometimes instead of hash, we use synchronized hash maps, and we also have used weak hash maps, because we know that weak hash maps, if we are storing that key value, the key value pair we have in hash map. So if the key is storing a null value, that weak hash map will allow you or allow the garbage collection internally to collect those, which hash maps doesn't allow. So many of the times when you think that sometimes some of the key values can be null, so in that case we are using weak maps. So these are some of the implementations that we have done, and apart from that we are trying to reduce the null checks, because most of the times what happens is that in GET APIs or POST APIs, sometimes the return object may be null. So in that case we use the Java 8 feature for like optional. So we know that optional can be used to check whether the object is present or not, and if it is not present, means it does not store null object, but it can hold that null reference. So we also implement optional for that. And from the code structure, I can say that functional interface is very much important, because we can give the implementation of this functional interface using the Lambda operation. So in the runtime, we are giving the implementation. We are not extending it, or we are not writing extra code. We can use that functional Lambda operator syntax for giving the parameters and return types at the runtime, or in a less boilerplate code, something like that.
So what is the use of concurrent hash map?
Okay, so concurrent hash map. So what happened is that in concurrent hash map, so if I go into the what I know actually, in the internal structure of any map, the map contains containers. Okay, so each container actually stores linked lists. It have a series of linked lists. So what happens in case of normal map or synchronized map, so whenever a particular thread is accessing any particular container, all the other containers will be locked. It will not allow any other containers to read or write anything. That is a synchronized map. Now we know that normal hash map is not synchronized, it's not thread safe, so we have other issues with that. But in case of concurrent hash maps, what happens is that if a particular thread is reading a particular, say, container 1, it is reading or writing something into it, it will only lock that particular container, and all the remaining containers will not be locked. They will be still available for reading.
Can you tell me one real example where you could use the concurrent hash map? Maybe one real-time example.
Okay, I haven't used in my real life, so I'm thinking of a scenario where we can use.
And this might be like you might have used. I can give you one clue. Like we might have used in multi-threaded application, right?
Yeah, I get it. So yeah, in multi-threaded application we can use it because for example, in our project where we using Vertex, so as it is event driven, so sometimes what happens is that we have multiple threads which are accessing a particular map that are storing the product and prices. So each product is particularly mapped to a particular price on the basis of a region. So in that case, what happens is that if I have a particular product and it is present in 2 regions, say it is in UK and it is also in Australia, so it will have 2 prices. Now, if in case of a concurrent hash map, I can just simply, when I'm updating the price of the US one, I will not allow the other thread to modify that particular US price. It can read the price of other regions, but it will not be able to modify the value of the US price because the lock is already acquired for that particular container. Something like that. I'm not that much sure because I haven't used concurrent hash maps that much in our project, but I'm just guessing we can do it like that for product and prices, something like that.
Okay. So like you have talked about Java Vertex, right? So can you tell me say like what are the advantage of using Java Vertex? So what is the need for that?
Okay. So what happens is if I just in an abstract way I say that Vertex is actually composed of different verticals. So we have different verticals which are deployed. So one vertical will be responsible for my DAO classes, one vertical will be responsible for my service classes, and one vertical is responsible for my router classes. Now in Vertex, what is happening is that it is event driven. So it is not waiting for someone to give the result. What happens in Spring Boot or Spring is that it is synchronous. It will always be dependent on the other methods or the other functions to return it something, and then it will perform the other function. If that particular method is not returning something, it will wait for it. It will not execute the other functions. So if I draw an analogy here, so suppose I have a task. Okay, so my task is to cook food, and I have me and my friend. So me and my friend are the 2 threads that are working. So my task is not dependent on what my friend is doing. So if I'm doing something, if I'm making tea, at the same time he can go and make some toasts or omelets. So it is not dependent on my task that I will finish making tea and then he will start that particular task of making a toast or making an omelet. And that in Vertex we handle with that with future. We have a object called future. It's an event handler. So whenever that particular event is handled, future will send the calling method, this method has been handled right now. Now you can go on and execute the rest of the business logics. So suppose, for example, I'm giving an example. I have a particular say product, and that product has to be inserted into the DynamoDB, but only when the product is particularly mapped to a certain color, certain price. So for color, I have a service. For a price, I have a service. Now the color method is calling another API to get the color of a particular product from DB. And the price is also handled by another method which is calling the DB to get the prices. Now when I receive the price, I will call both these methods. Now suppose the color method have already called the color DB and it retrieved the color, and future will say, I have got the color, so now you can take the color. But my price, we haven't received the price yet. So what will happen? It will not wait for the price. For the time being, it will perform the other logics which is related to the color portion. Say after the color we want what are the color, different types of color available for this particular product. So it will apply those business logic. It will not wait for the price. Now when the price is handled, future will send the method, I have got the price now. Now you can also execute the price logics. And now in this way I have configured both prices and colors, but making optimum means I'm using the code to this optimum. I'm using multiple threads and I'm using it in series of events. I'm not waiting for a particular event to occur first, and then I'm not moving to this next event, but in a concurrent way I'm using it. So something like that.
So like, is it possible to run a batch job using the Java Vertex?
Yes, in case of insertion, means when we ingest the data in the DB, we sometimes use batch items. So what happens is that in batch items, so we have a default value, say 100 or 200. So in batches of 200, it will just load all the data, save all the data into the DB, something like that. We can configure that. We have deployment options. We have the DynamoDB table options where we can configure that. And it also allows you some. So what happens is that when we perform the batch operation, one problem that we have is DynamoDB throttle. So simultaneously, when you are inserting number of projects, the number of products, the DynamoDB couldn't handle it. So it will have a throttling. So in case of throttling, it will throw an error. It will give a log that DynamoDB throttling is occurring, so we cannot insert these records. So what DynamoDB offers is retry operation. So we can configure the retry operation. So by default, I think retry operation is 3, but we can configure it to 10 or 11. So once it cannot insert the particular data or batch of data into the DB, so it will again try. So it will try up to the number that we have specified. So if I specify 10 times, so it will go on for 10 times. If it is not inserted, if it is inserted, then it will not take that particular number into consideration.
Okay, so if you're running a batch job, so for example, your batch job calls an endpoint. Endpoint is a different third-party web service. Consider it's a REST API or a SOAP API, kind of a third-party endpoint. So if you're consuming that endpoint, so if there is during your batch run, so there might be getting some timeout errors during those batch job execution. So in that case, like how will you retry those records, or how will you reprocess those records? So in case, suppose you have thousands of records and 500 of them were processed and 500 were failed due to the connectivity issue or any other timing issue or any issue with respect to the third-party endpoint. So in that case, like how you handle the error or failed mechanism, like how will you retry the failed records which has been failed status?
So there are two ways. The first one is that it cannot be handled. What we do is that we again do the entire operation again. So what will happen that DynamoDB allows you upsert operation. So those 500 records will be inserted for the first time, and what was already inserted, they will be upserted, means updated and then inserted. And the second case is that we are using actually web client. Okay, so Vertex offers you a web client. So web client is something like you can call the other service with a particular URI, uniform resource indicator, and you give the headers and all those things. And if something happens, as you said, that if there is a timeout, so internally it calls an event bus. So event bus is something like that. You can say it's a mode of communication. So it goes on putting the data in a form of a queue in the event bus. Okay. So what will happen is that if I'm getting a connectivity error for a particular operation, so the objects which are already in the queue, those will be inserted. But if some of the objects which are not in the queue and we got a connectivity error, so those objects or those products will be lost. So what we have to do, we have to again run the entire operation again. So this is a drawback we are having, and we are trying to handle this. So there are certain things. Actually, the project is already in, it's not completed. There are many stories in the backlog. So we also have to implement the security also. We haven't implemented the security. So in that case, currently we're just using a particular header as a mode of security for calling one service to another. So you have to also implement the security. So there are some drawbacks in having such a certain applications as these applications. So one scenario that you said just now, that what happens in the connectivity issue. So the data is lost. When I go to the AWS console, I see that there is a connectivity issue. So I go to Kibana or Grafana, and I can see that this amount of products has not been inserted. So I have to run the entire application again. So there are certain drawbacks, but what it gives you is that in case of any real-time application, you can use Vertex because of this event handling mechanism, which was not provided by Spring Boot. So that's why we started with Spring Boot and then we moved to Vertex.
Okay. Oh, you have worked with REST and SOAP web services, right? So
not SOAP, but I've used REST. Yeah.
REST, not SOAP. Okay. So like, what are all the things you needed to create a new REST API? So how will you write? I just want to create, and you consider you are a producer of the web service. So you just want to write your own web service to consume at other end. So what are all the things needed? So how will you secure your web service?
Okay. So if I can do it in two ways, means in Vertex also, and in case of Spring Boot also. So if I start with Vertex, so what we do is, for in case of any RESTful API, we have certain endpoints, say get endpoints or post endpoints. So post is for saving something, and get is for retrieving certain attributes. So first, what we'll do is we'll define all these endpoints in the YML file. We'll give certain validations. We'll give the mapping, means what UI I have to call. I have to mention whether it is in case of a get operation or in case of a post operation. We put in case of post operation, we put everything in the JSON body or the request body. But in case of request get API, what we do is that we either use path variable or we use request parameters. So in case of path variables, I have to define the everything in the URL structure. But in case of request parameters, is not in the URL structure. We can use it as optional, and we can define that these are the request parameters. We generally configure it with a question mark or the with that sign. So I have defined my endpoints. Now I have to map those to my particular methods. So I will have my router vertical, as I said. So the router vertical's purpose, it just like it provides a routing context. So it actually internally extends the HTTP request servlet. So the routing context is responsible for mapping these endpoints to particular method. So what I'll do is that I will first retrieve the parameters that I have already defined in my endpoint. So suppose I'm trying to get a particular product with a particular ID. So my request parameter is ID. So I will do that routing context dot get ID get param, and within that I will mention the string name or the particular request parameter name, and I will retrieve the ID. Now once I retrieve the ID, I will pass it to my service layer first. The service layer will do some operations or checks, provide some anti-corruption or validation things, whether the ID is valid or not, whether I have supplied some invalid IDs. And after that, the call will move to the DAO class. In the DAO class, I am using DynamoDB, so I will just do load async, or asynchronously loading the item, or I will just simply write the DynamoDB name and I will write load and I will give the ID. So the entire document will be loaded. And once I get that entire document, I can map it to a DTO. Okay, so I will already define a DTO because I cannot expose the entire DB model. I need a DTO for that. So I'll map it. I will do it either by using a JSON decoder, map this, or I can also use model mappers for mapping the model to a DTO. So once I receive the DTO, I will send it back to the vertical. In the vertical, I have routing context. Routing context provide you a HTTP response. So routing context response, I will just encode it prettily and I will just expose it. I can expose it in the Postman, or I can again provide a wrapper for it, and I can provide it to the JSP classes, and the UI guys will then use those values and map those and show it to the front end users, something like that. And in case of a Spring Boot, it is almost similar, same things, but what happens is that they don't have this routing context, so we have the annotations, so request mapping or say get mapping, post mapping. So request mapping is as a whole. When you say request mapping, it can be both post and it can be get. So you have to exclusively mention which method you are using. So better I use the get mapping because it will say that I'm using the get method or getter method or the get endpoint. I have to mention the URL, and in case of post mapping, I have to mention the response request body. I will mention the path variables, or in case of request parameters, I will give the request parameters. I can use it for the same purpose that I have done for the router vertical, that is calling a service, then I'm calling a DAO, and then I'm retrieving the entity, mapping it to a DTO, and then providing it to the front end. And in case of security, that we haven't applied, but what we are planning right now is that in Vertex, we cannot apply the Spring Boot security. So when we used to have Spring Boot, you applied some of the JWT concepts. So what happened is that we had a user model, user management class, and this user management class will have that authorization and authentication manager builder. So I can use that. I can use the web security configure adapter to override the configure method, and I can provide my own custom roles and my custom authentication and authorization logics. And using that, I can authorize my calls. But most of the time, what happens is that our APIs are called internally by the other squad. It is not exposed to the end users or other third-party users. So for the time being, we are just using some hard-coded values for that, so that the hard-coded values are just validated in the header. And if that calling API or posting API is having those values, we just allow them to access our my responses.
So how will you store the how will you validate using the security credentials? So it's a kind of a username password for the each and every endpoint. That's what you're saying.
No, we are using some tokens, so hard-coded tokens for that. We are providing the tokens in the
Okay.
header and it's coming from there.
It's a kind of
But we
OAuth
have
application. Or you have heard of
no, it is
OAuth?
JWT token. JWT
Okay.
tokens.
Okay.
Yeah, it is still under implementation.